Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the first part of GSA 100, More Crawling Scenarios. In this session, we'll learn about additional web crawling topics. We'll discuss the importance of document dates and see how the GSA can be configured to handle different date formats and locations. Finally, we'll review Secure Crawl and Serve with a specific look at using LDAP for authentication. What happens when a URL is crawled? The GSA sends an HTTP GET request to your web server, just like any other browser, and it identifies itself as GSA Crawler instead of Firefox, Chrome, or Internet Explorer. When it receives a response, it examines the response headers. One of those is content length. If this is too large, the GSA will simply ignore the document entirely. It won't show up in the index at all. You can specify maximum document sizes on the host load schedule page. The defaults are very large and usually don't have to be increased. Then the GSA will need to actually look at the response body. If it's not HTML, the GSA will convert it to HTML. The GSA only indexes HTML, but it has converters for most common file formats. Finally, if the HTML size exceeds the amount set on the index settings page, the GSA will truncate the file and index only that amount. By default, the GSA uses a continuous crawl. It will crawl documents throughout the day as appropriate for each document. Some documents change more frequently than others, and the GSA should crawl them more frequently. Others change less frequently and should be crawled accordingly. The GSA, over time, will learn the change frequency of each document and crawl it appropriately. It will optimize the crawl schedule to do the least amount of work with the most effectiveness. We recommend the use of continuous crawl for this reason. Even so, you might find that the GSA crawls some of your content more frequently than you'd like. Your application servers may not be able to handle the number of requests the GSA makes. The GSA may have difficulty identifying the optimal crawl schedule if document dates aren't configured properly. If you encounter one of these problems, you can adjust the crawl frequency using host load schedule and freshness tuning. The GSA does have a scheduled crawl option. This will force all crawling to occur within a specific period of time. This will often cause the GSA and your web server to do more work than they really need to, because the GSA will simply recrawl everything it can within that scheduled period. The scheduled crawl option is often used to fix crawl frequency problems, but there are usually better options for that. We can use host load schedule and freshness tuning to increase or decrease the crawl frequency as appropriate. Host load schedule lets you specify the number of concurrent connections used by the GSA overall, or when crawling specific hosts at specific times. If you have an application server that isn't capable of handling the sheer number of GSA requests, this can be used to reduce the number to a manageable one. Freshness tuning lets you specify that some URLs change more or less frequently than others. URL patterns used in crawl frequently will be crawled more than once a day if possible. URL patterns used in crawl infrequently will only be crawled once. You will need to tell the GSA to recrawl them if they change. You can do that from this page as well. Finally, you can tell the GSA to recrawl documents regardless of how they respond to if modified since requests, which we'll discuss a bit later. Windows file systems are case insensitive. You can get to the same file regardless of whether you use uppercase or lowercase characters to specify its name. Unix file systems are case sensitive. As a result, Windows web servers are also case insensitive, but Unix web servers can either be case sensitive or not, depending on how they're configured. So, when the GSA crawls content, it will assume by default that URLs are case sensitive. But if you have web pages that were written by hand, you may have the same URL represented using different case in different places, and the GSA will treat those representations as different URLs. If you have Windows web servers or case-insensitive Unix web servers, you should specify the appropriate URL patterns on the case-insensitive patterns page. You will need to do this before you crawl and index the documents on those servers. If you don't, you'll need to remove the documents from the index, then recrawl them. The GSA relies on a web server to tell it when documents have changed. By default, Web servers do this by returning a last modified response header. A web browser can then store the page locally, and when it requests the page again, it can send an if modified since request header. If the page hasn't changed, the web server will return a 304 not modified status code instead of returning the actual page, and the browser can serve the page from its cache. This is the caching mechanism built into HTTP. The GSA also relies on this mechanism. It will store last modified dates and send if modified since request headers. But what if your web server doesn't return or understand these headers? In that case, the GSA will have to fetch the entire page every time, then do a checksum to identify whether it changed. And more importantly, the GSA won't be able to tell when it changed, just that it has or hasn't since the last crawl. As a result, it won't be able to optimize the crawl schedule nearly as well and will likely overcrawl your content. This is a very common problem with application servers that use Java, .NET, ColdFusion, or any other programming language to generate responses. Most web programmers don't bother including support for HTTP caching, and application servers can't handle the same number of requests as a static web server, so the crawl may cause performance issues. The best possible solution here is to fix the application code to include support for last modified and if modified since, but that may be difficult in many cases. As an alternative, the GSA can be given other places to look for document dates. There are 4 additional places it can be told to look: within a meta tag, within the URL, title, or document body. Out of these alternatives, a meta tag is by far the best choice. You will need to read the documentation specifying allowed formats carefully to ensure that you're using a valid format. You can specify different document date rules for different URL patterns. For each URL, the GSA will go through the list of rules in sequential order and will apply the first match. By default, there's a single rule that matches everything. If you want to keep this catch-all rule as a default match, make sure you move it to the bottom of your list. In GSA 50, you learned about the basics of secure crawl and serve using HTTP basic authentication. To configure a secure crawl, you go to either Crawler Access or Forms Authentication under Content Sources, Web Crawl, Secure Crawl. Then, to configure a secure serve, you go to Search, Secure Search, Universal Login Auth Mechanisms, and choose the appropriate mechanism. If you have a directory server like Active Directory that supports Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP, you can use that with the GSA for many things. It can authenticate access to the admin console, it can authenticate secure search users, it can identify group membership for use with permissions list on the GSA called ACLs, and it can be used to authenticate users for creating alerts or adding user results. The GSA can only be used with one LDAP server for these things, however. First, configure the GSA so that it can connect to the LDAP server under Administration, LDAP Setup. This will require the connection attributes, and typically it will also require a username and password for an account that has permission to read all attributes within LDAP. If you want to use LDAP to authenticate access to the admin console, you can specify groups for administrators and users here also. To use LDAP for authentication or group lookup for secure search users, just go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms and choose the LDAP tab. You can use it with a credential group that's already configured to perform authentication if you want to enable group lookup for ACLs. Let's take a look at using LDAP for secure serve. To do this, the first thing I'm going to need to do is make sure I actually have some secure content in my index. And I've already set that up ahead of time. Under Content Sources, Crawler Access, I have a URL pattern that requires HTTP basic authentication. So my GSA has already gone out and fetched that data. I've also got it listed under my start and block URLs. And if I go to the index screen and go to index diagnostics, I should be able to see it in there as well. So there are the documents that require authentication. Now, to actually set up Secure Serve, ultimately I'm going to need to go to the search menu and set up universal login auth mechanisms. But before I can do that, I need to actually register an LDAP server to use for authentication. So for that, I'll go to Administration, LDAP Setup, and click on Create. I'll enter the name and port number of my LDAP server. The default port number for LDAP is 389, but in a Windows environment, you will typically use something called the Global Catalog port. Ask your network administrator about that if you need to. And you'll need a username and password that can actually read the LDAP data. In an Active Directory environment, this is typically going to be an administrator. So I'll click on Continue. And if it's able to talk to LDAP, it'll reach out, fill out this screen. And you'll notice we have some entries here for the LDAP search base, user search filter, group search filter. With Active Directory, the GSA does a pretty good job of filling these out for us. Finally, I'll need to actually test to make sure that I can validate a user's credentials. So I'll enter a username and password for a search user, and then click on Test LDAP Settings. I should get back a message in green letting me know that authentication succeeded. Now, it's very important to scroll down to the bottom here and click on Save LDAP Settings. If you don't do that, it'll forget everything you just put in, and you'll have to start from scratch. Once I've saved my LDAP settings, just to verify that, I'll go back to LDAP Setup, and I should see that one line in here for my LDAP server. Now, I can go to the search screen, go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. Now, it is possible to use LDAP just for group lookup, in which case I would use one of these other mechanisms for the actual act of authentication. I could, for example, use HTTP, since the web server will support that automatically in this case. But I'm going to go ahead and just go to LDAP and use that for authentication. So I'll need to specify a mechanism name. This can really be anything you want it to be. I would stick to letters and underscores and dashes. And you'll need to choose your LDAP configuration. You'll only have one entry here. And then you can choose whether or not you want to do authentication, whether or not you want to do group lookup. I'll leave that blank for now because all I'm interested in is authentication. Now I can click on Save. And once that's saved successfully, I can go ahead and run a search. So if I go to a search screen and choose Public and Secure Content, I can go ahead and run a search for some content that I know is in that secure directory. I'll search for the word salmon. I should be prompted for credentials, and I'll go ahead and enter the credentials of the search user. And I get back my restricted files. So these are, at least one of these is in the restricted directory. The other one is actually public. So for me to get that back, the GSA took my credentials, sent them to the LDAP server, verified that my credentials matched. I can actually verify that myself by going under serving logs. So if I go under reports, serving logs, and look at my salmon query, I can actually see the process of that query. I can see the authentication process. I can see that I was authenticated via LDAP. And once I'm authenticated, I can see what happens with authorization. So it finds my username. I'm in LDAP. I can see if I have any documents that match using ACLs. I would be able to bring those back. If I have user permission to those, since I didn't do a group lookup, I would be able to bring those documents back. There are 2 documents that are actually relevant, and to actually test my access, the GSA used the head requester for that one document. This concludes our first presentation, More Crawling Scenarios. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 100 presentations.